Hello, my name is Vince, and today we are going to get into the angelic wars. We are going to mainly focus at the end on the war in heaven. The war will escalate at the midpoint of the tribulation period. So we will look into the history and we will talk about that escalation today. Just a reminder, this is a three-part study. Part one, we covered the midpoint abomination of desolation by the Antichrist. Now, part two, as you know, is the angelic war, but part three is also exciting. That is our next video, and that is called The Flight of the Woman, why many people in Israel will flee to the mountains of southern Jordan. What we will be investigating today is a history of the angelic war, both in heaven and on earth. Secondly, we really want to focus on why this war escalates so much right at the midpoint of the tribulation period. And lastly, why this war in heaven changes everything on earth. Let's go. Let's focus on how this angelic war all started. In 1 John 3:8b, it talks about the devil sinned from the beginning. We find that verse in the beginning is also a reference to his name being the serpent of old, or literally the serpent of primeval. Now, first of all, we need to understand that according to Luke 10:18, Jesus witnessed the defeat of Satan. It said, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. And this is very important because this is a past tense event. Satan had fallen before Revelation 12, before the ministry of Jesus as the Son of Man. Now, there is a taunt that is given by Isaiah in Isaiah 14:3. It is a command of God, and he is specifically talking about the king of Babylon. So we look at this, and when we look at the text inside of this chapter, we start to realize this is really talking about an angelic being, a created being of God. And we look at verses like Isaiah 14:12 to 15, and this is what we learn. It says, how you have fallen from heaven, O star of the morning, son of the dawn. This is not easy to translate here. It is very difficult to translate because it is only mentioned in one place of the Bible when it says son of the dawn. Now it's important we recognize he has been cut down to earth. He has fallen. Therefore, if he is fallen and he is cut down to earth, where did he fall from? Well, it says from heaven. It's quite obvious. But very importantly here, it says even more. It calls him the star of the morning, not Lucifer like most Bibles translate in the Latin, and it calls him the son of the dawn. This is implying that he was one of God's angels, and he was created during the morning time and the earliest part of the morning. So it is pointing to the fact that this is one of God's earliest creations who he is talking about. It says, you who have weakened the nations. Well, what nations? If he was cut down the earth, were there nations on earth? These are more than likely angelic nations that had fallen with this particular angel we refer to as the devil. And why did they fall? It says, because you said in your heart, I'm going to do 5 I wills. It says in verse 13, I will ascend to the heavens. Who lives in heaven? God. And then he says, I will raise up my throne above the star of God. The implication here is he wanted to make himself greater than the other angels. Then he says, I will sit on the mount of assembly in the recesses of the north. I will sit on the mount of assembly shows that that is a place where the Son of God sits, the Word of the Lord sits. And it talks about the Mount of the Assembly, which is the meeting place of angels in heaven, and it says in the lower parts of the north. So if you were to go straight north, in the lowest part, the Mount of the Assembly, that is where the meeting place of angels is with God. And by being in the lower parts of the north, the implication is showing us here at this particular place that there are higher levels above it. So this is the seat where the Son of God would sit and meet and interact with the angels. And why did they interact? Well, you'll find this in early chapter of Job. You will find it in Job 1. They had to go there specifically to give accountability. But this particular angel decided he wanted to sit on the Mount of the Assembly in the resources of the North. So he wanted that primary seat. And then he said he's going upward again with another I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. Well, who lives always above the clouds? That's right. That is the location of the Father. And why does he want to do that? Because he wants to make himself like the Most High. That is in last I will of the five I wills. He wants to become like God. And where did we hear that before? Did we not hear that in the Garden of Eden? Hey, Eve, when you eat the fruit of this tree, you could be like God. Do we not hear that from some of the cults today that are out there? You could be like God. It is a lie. Now, you'll notice he wanted to keep going upward, higher and higher. But here's the problem. The problem is given in verse 15. God says, not gonna happen. He says, nevertheless, even though you said you're going to keep moving up, you will be thrust down to Sheol, that is the grave, and then he expands it to the recesses of the pit, the lower levels of the pit. That is where we recognize there is the containment angels, contained angels that have fallen. We refer to it, or Peter refers to it as Tartarus. It is the lower levels of containment of spirit beings. After the fall of the enemy, after the king of Babylon got these five I wills in his heart and wanted to ascend above the throne, he needed the participation of the other angels. Now you will find that later on. We'll look at Revelation 12:4, and we'll find that the other angels were brought down or swept down to the earth, and they participated in this revolt against God. But from it, there became destruction, and then came the new beginning. Now, before we go into the explanation of this, consider subscribing so you can catch all our videos. Also, if you get anything from it, please give us a thumbs up so we can move this into the views of other people. Now, let's talk about the enemy here and what happened. First of all, you have to recognize Ecclesiastes 1:10. But even before it, it says in 1:9 that nothing new appears under the sun. It's always been there. Look at 1:10. Already it has existed for ages which were before us. Who's us? Solomon, yes, but he's talking about people before men. Everything existed before. Yes, computers and autos and airplanes are not new. They existed at one time or another. Furthermore, even the mystery that the Gentiles would be co sharers in the inheritance, that was hidden for ages. In other words, before the church existed, everything that what God was going to do, the inheritance that the church and the Jewish people were going to get, was a result of the fact that God knew that a fall would happen during the ages before us. Now, look at Genesis 1, verses 1 and 2. Let's look at the first verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Some say this is summarizing chapter 1 and 2. No, it is not, because if you ignore verse 2, you could see certain things were already existent. It says, and the earth became formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. Let's look at this piece by piece. The earth, literally Haya, not was, but became formless or a waste and void or desolate. So, in other words, there was the existence of an earth, but its condition was from devastation. What made it become a waste and desolate? So, that was present. But underneath it was darkness. So, over the surface of the deep, there was darkness. So, in other words, darkness is where God is not at, but it did exist, didn't it? It's there, and it was over the surface of the deep or the waters. So, in other words, the water, darkness, and a formless and void earth were always existing because God, when He creates something and says it is good. So, this was the containment area by the Spirit to hold the fallen world in its place until God started his new creation. And when he started that new creation, it tells us in Genesis 1:26, God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over all the earth." Guess what? It was not the king of Babylon and his followers that were going to rule this earth, but it was put there and recreated in its new state so that men could rule. The Bible tells us there was a transfer of rule. The serpent becomes the king of this world, the ruler of this world. And we find out about how that happens in Genesis chapter 3 when Adam listens to his wife Eve and eats from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, where the serpent was. So, in listening to the serpent rather than listening to God, see, all he had to do was trust God because he didn't know good and evil. We find that out also near the end of Genesis chapter 3. Because he did not know good and evil, he fell. And therefore, the rights of rule of men was transferred to the serpent. The serpent had bought himself some time. But also in Genesis 3, we learn of a promise that God was going to deal with the serpent. He would give him a fatal blow and then contend with his son or his seed. Now, in Genesis 4 and 6, we start learning that the fall was not only the changes for the world we live in, but there were also conditions being added there afterwards. What were they? Well, let's talk about how they started in Genesis 4. Now, you have, according to the book of Enoch, 200 watcher angels that entered the human realm. They decided to do some things to men and women that were something that God did not ordain. They entered into what we would call strange flesh. Now, this is to set up a new world order, the new system of Babylon on earth. There was already a Babylonian system in the outer atmosphere above the earth where Satan operated with his fallen angels. The first change we see is polygamy. This happens because of a descendant of Cain named Lamech. He takes two wives. You know who he learned that from, right? The fallen angels. So he takes a second wife. You can multiply more children and you can have more fun with two wives rather than just one wife. And so begins polygamy, which did not exist when man was created. A woman and a man were to be one. From Adah, the first wife, they had a son, Lamech and Adah, named Jabal. And Jabal was the first to dwell in tents and have livestock. And why was that important? Because now the sacrifices that would be made to God and provide a covering for men, clothing, were no longer available. So these things are being satanically driven not only by angels on earth, but also angels of influence in the spirit realm, because we learned from Adah's other boy, Jubal, that he became the first to be able to play musical instruments. So now the spirits could work behind the scenes and be able to influence mankind that way. And then Zillah, the second wife. Well, her and Lamech had another son named Tubal came, and he became the forger of implements of bronze and iron. So he made metal instruments, tools, and weapons. And you notice it says bronze and iron. That signifies there really was not a bronze and an iron age. They happened at the same time. Why was it all being done? Well, his sister, Tubal-Cain's sister, was Naamah, and she had something to do with it because she was a knockout. She was one beautiful woman. But before we get to that, which we will get to in a half a second, or a half a minute rather, we want to talk about Lamech. See, a man warns him, hey, what's going on here is all wrong. You're going against what God does. So he killed this man, and we have our second martyr, because nobody had been killed since Cain. So as a result of it, you could see now you're getting to the point where you have weapons and you can murder people. But what other change happens? We find that in Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, that the Nephilim were on earth in those days and also afterwards, when the sons of God, don't miss this, because this has to do with the watcher angels, they're stars, they're sons of God, came into the daughters of men and bore children to them. And from that, you have these mighty men who were giants as a result of it. So you have a contamination of angelic gene with human gene. And now, by that contamination, these beings, which were satanic in creation and never meant to be, would not only help to control the livestock, influence men, but provide the means to kill people with the weaponry. And yes, Azazel wanted it because he wanted Naamah's, Tubal-Cain's sister. And he was the first angel to interact with the daughter of men, to have intercourse, and other angels thereafter follow. You have a new Babylonian system on earth from an angelic war that started with the fall of man. The world now, from this new satanic Babylonian system that got put into place before the flood, is now so bad that God is bringing on the waters. And so this war will continue after the flood, but he preserves one man and his family only so the promise of the seed of Genesis 3:15, who will deliver the vital blow to Satan, can still happen. Also, he wants more people to be born so more people could get saved and be a part of his kingdom. Now, Genesis 9 tells us that he implements the Noahic covenant. And basically, the way this works, whoever sheds man's blood, man has been given the responsibility to shed his blood. In other words, you kill somebody, men should organize to kill you. Secondly, they are told to be fruitful, to multiply, and populate the earth abundantly. Now, when we take these aspects into consideration, we understand God is setting up his new system of order after the flood. And if you go back and remember Genesis 2, where was the world after it was destroyed, after Satan revolted? It was underwater. The same thing happened, but God made a promise in this covenant. It's not going to be underwater again. So water again is obviously, when it's in that volume, an act of God's judgment. Now along comes one of these descendants of Noah, a man by the name of Nimrod, and he is next to implement a new world order. Now this becomes vitally important because he is doing the same thing that our study in the abomination of desolation told us about. I think the verse was Daniel 7:27, and it's going to go ahead and he's again going to speak out against God. So he is organizing people to come to his side, and then after he does that, his goal is to change the times of God and the laws of God. Now let's look at it this way: pressuring people to settle in the land of Shinar and to build a city. This is what Nimrod does. This is the next stage of the angelic war. In fact, Nimrod was professed to be a giant, so probably on the mother's side, he was born with a giant mother. If that's true, I don't know. That is more legend. It is a possibility. Now, why is he organizing men? He is organizing them to oppose God. Why were men supposed to organize before? They were to organize to protect from the shedding of blood. If you had a murderer, you would oppose that murderer by organizing. So he's turning around. Now he's going out there and changing the law and saying it's okay to organize. We can do what we want. We can disobey God. We can build a city. Why not make a name for ourselves? We'll build this tower that reaches into the heavens to show him we could get way up there and be just like God. But God confuses their language. God sends them and spreads them throughout the globe. So this new form of Babylon is established, but it is established in a way where now people cannot communicate anymore. So let's look at what he was trying to do. Satan's atmospheric host organized once again to counter God's established system. Don't think there weren't spirits working behind what Nimrod is doing. That is part of the war. Remember, he is trying to control the only terrain that Satan has, that is earth. But he realizes next, in order to do that, he has to be able to change any of the appointed times of God. One of them, again, being the prophesied woman's seed. And finally, Satan begins his work when he speaks out against God by changing God's law to what his commands are. And that is how the system that we live in today got established. Let's talk about the next stage of this angelic war. We know the Tower of Babel was destroyed. We know the people of the world were spread throughout the globe and their languages became different at that particular point. But often what we don't know is one other thing that God did. What he did is mentioned in my title here. God gives control of the Gentiles to the gods. Wow. Why would he do that? Well, because when they built the Tower of Babel, all people united against God, being influenced by Satan in this angelic war, and decided to oppose him. As a result, though, even though now they have different languages, God says, okay, these wanted to follow you. They wanted to follow the rebellious heavenly host, the leaders here, the gods. They wanted to follow the sons of God. I am going to give them to you. I am going to let you follow them. Well, where does this come from? This comes from the Septuagint translation of the Bible. It's in Deuteronomy 32. Now, it's vital to understand why this is so important. Sometimes the Septuagint is criticized, but I believe it to be a very good translation because our Old Testaments aren't as ancient as the translation of the Septuagint. For example, ours was translated by the Masoretes, and there's over 1,000 years of distance apart from the two translations. So we get more of an ancient perspective from the Septuagint, and furthermore, we get a non biased perspective because Christ was not even born at that time. So let's look at verses 7 to 9 in Deuteronomy 32. Remember the days of old, consider the years for past ages. Ask thy father, and he shall relate to thee, thine elders, and they shall tell thee. In other words, he's telling the people that are reading this of Israel, Go back and look at what the history show. You'll see there were past ages. You'll see there was days of old. Furthermore, you'll see there was a time in verse 8, there was a time when the Most High divided the nations and separated the sons of Adam. So, in other words, we already know about this. Confused the languages and spread the people out across the globe. Sometimes what we don't recognize is what it says here, also in verse 8. He set bounds of the nation according to the numbers of the angels of God. So, in other words, there were boundaries set where people could not easily move from one to the other and organize in any form. But furthermore, he gave them to the angels of God. And that's what we're talking about here. He gave control of the Gentiles to the angels that were behind what they were listening to, the leading angels. So, in other words, this is, they wanted you, I am giving them to you. But he did one other thing. He kept the people for himself. We find that in verse 9. And his people, Jacob, became the portion of the Lord, and Israel was the line of his inheritance. So for hundreds and hundreds of years, he had a separated people of his own, people who were from Jacob, who were descendants of Abraham. Now, this becomes very important. Now we understand all the hostilities of how the world's nations have that satanic influence behind them and are out to get God's people. But God's people did not remain loyal. They were told not to follow the gods, but many did. So after the death of Jesus Christ on the cross, we get to the next phase of the angelic war, and he lets people choose sides now. The seed of woman finally came, and when he came, God made one alteration. He says, okay, all those branches of the olive tree in Romans 11, I'm going to break them off because they're not worthy of me, because they did not keep faith. However, I'm going to graft in wild olive branches, the Gentiles, and they are now going to replace them. So, in essence, what is going on, Jesus grafts in the ex-serpents, and they also today are his people. So, God has two types of people: Israel by genetic birth, and then the church, which includes those of Israel's, but also includes Gentiles, people who gain citizenry with the nation of Israel, not by genetic birth. So why is there this escalation in the war at the midpoint, and why does it escalate all the way up to heaven? Now, a lot of scholars will tell you, well, it's because the abomination of desolation just happened. You'll see a different perspective in our next slide because they happen at the same time. What is going on, our backdrop is given in Revelation 12, verses 1 to 4. The first event that it talks about in the first two verses is a great sign appears in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And she was with child, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. Well, if we understand verse 2, it is definitely telling us that the nation was bearing the Christ child. In essence, this was an event that has happened. However, the birth of the nation has not yet happened, for we are waiting for the return of this child. And this is exactly what the enemy knows is going on. The Christ child will be returning. It confirms that it's talking about Christ child later on in chapter 12. But what we have here is God looking at the nation of Israel a little bit different that he is looking to them when they were in rebellion. And the woman here represents the remnant of Israel. And it says about her that she is the one that's going to bring in the child. Why? Because she is clothed in the sun. Well, what does that mean? If you look at Psalm 84:11, it tells us that she is clothed in the Lord's grace and glory.
And the fact that she is standing on the moon, her feet are on top of it, like in Hebrews 10:29, whenever something is underfoot, it is an insult to what is underfoot. In other words, what you see here is this final 1260 days we refer to as the night is going to be trampled on by the remnant of Israel. Let me kind of explain it. What do we see the night represented as in the New Testament? The night is coming when no man can work. We have only our two witnesses that are going to be able to work, and they had to be with God and never die. That would be Enoch and Elijah. However, what is further going on, it is talking about this 1260 final days is going to be looked on with contempt by the nation of Israel. In essence, it is showing a disregard for the night that is coming when no man can work, and it is showing that they are going to hate the time of Jacob's trouble, which they will go through. Now, on her head is a crown of 12 stars. Whenever you have stars, you have an angel or a son of God represented. So, therefore, the nation is now achieved equal status in God's eyes as the Son of God. Another sign that appears in heaven. Notice again, it is in heaven. And behold, a great dragon having 7 heads, 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems. Now you notice it says past tense here. And his tail swept away a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. So we understand here this is the opponent of the woman. And the idea of showing that the has the same symbolism that you see in Daniel that the beast has is there is that affiliation between the spirit realm and the physical realm that we live in. But the point of showing that a third of the stars were swept out of heaven and through to earth shows that this is the representation of who does oppose the nation of Israel when they fell in Luke 10:18, when Jesus saw Satan fall like lightning, and now they were thrown down to the earth. So they have to be able to move from where they are at back up to heaven for this angelic war to happen at the midpoint. Again, it is at the same time as the abomination of desolation.
All right, let's continue on with this war in heaven. Now, you understand that there were certain signs shown. Number one, God looks at the nation of Israel from a different perspective. They are being clothed positionally in his glory by that sign. Secondly, it's about the Christ child coming back. And thirdly, it is about Satan's defending the one place he will have left, and that is the earth. Now we see some interesting information in Revelation 12, verses 7 through 9. And it says, "And there was war in heaven, Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels waged war, and they were not strong enough. There was no longer a place found for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole earth. He was thrown down to earth, and his angels were thrown down with him." Now you will notice that he had taken his angels to earth, where he had initially organized his attack in verse 4 against God. So he was already on earth. So what is happening here in heaven? Well, what you're seeing is something that is going on that's not often looked at from the perspective that I'm presented. First of all, we recognize this event, this war takes place on the first day of the last 1260 days. And that is the same day that the abomination of desolation takes place. This is no coincidence, because ultimately this is pointing to that at the same time that the Antichrist has taken God's cosmic geography on earth his sacred place, Satan is also going to do one thing. He is going to make a final attempt of what he promised in Isaiah 14. And what was it that he promised in Isaiah 14? Remember, when we looked at those verses earlier, he was going to go all the way up to heaven and he was going to be like God. So this is a second act on trying to take God's throne in the heavens above. And Michael's ready for that. So his angels are prepared. They're defending God's holy ground there in heaven. And ultimately, the archangel Michael defeats the dragon, and therefore Michael's angels become the victor, and the red dragon's angels are cast down to earth. You will notice that when they was no longer a place found, they were thrown down to earth. Well, what that means that heaven is no longer accessible to them. Understand, in the Bible, if you look at books like Job in the first chapter, you will notice that the angels had a place before God periodically in heaven. And now, in essence, that is taboo. It cannot happen anymore. As a matter of fact, they are now going to be contained to the earth. They can no longer leave the earth, and they are going to be held there for their final defeat. Now, you also notice some other things over here, and that is there are some descriptive terms that are given to the devil here. Again, these are not his names. They are descriptive terms. Satan means the adversary. Devil means the slanderer. So he's God's enemy. He's our enemy. He's slandered us before God. The serpent of old means that he is primeval. In other words, that he was the first in the fall. That's what it's talking about. The person that started it all. And then you have dragon, and it's not in Hebrew here, but it's Tanin, and you would find a good reference for that in Isaiah 27:1, where it talks about this being the Leviathan, the sea monster that God defeated and will defeat again. Now here, this is a process, understand, that is necessarily for achieving what is needing to be fulfilled in Isaiah 14:15. And we'll get to that on our next slide. And so if we understand here, with the red dragon and his angels being cast to earth, he now must make his last stand. He knows his time is running out, his days are running short. We also know that when we were talking earlier about Isaiah 14, that we had these five I wills, which caused him to ascend upward. But he says, you will be thrust down to Sheol, to the recesses of the pit, in Isaiah 14:15. In other words, he is not yet there. But this is the ultimate goal that God has planned for him, that he is going into Tartarus. There he will be contained within the lowest levels of the pit, and he will be restricted there for a period of 1,000 years. We also understand something else by a chapter in Psalm 82. And I'm going to read verse 1, and I'm going to read part of verse 5, and then through verse 8. And this is what it says. God makes his stand in his own congregation. He judges in the midst of the rulers. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. And I said, you are gods, with a small g, and all of you are sons of the Most High, implying angels. Nevertheless, you will die like mere men and fall like any one of the princes. Arise, O God, and judge the earth, for it is thou that dost possess all the nations. Now understand, here we are again. He is talking to the 69 pagan rulers, the gods that oversee the nations that they were given in Deuteronomy 32, in the verse that we looked at from the Septuagint earlier. And so, in essence, what's happening is look, you guys have done a bad job over here. You haven't been good judges. And now it's my turn to judge. And the promises he has given these angels here is that they will die like men and fall like any one of the princes. Let's stop and think about this here. What is actually going on? When they are cast out of heaven, they will literally appear in visible form as men on earth. Now, I don't know if this is all the angels, but definitely it is talking about the rulers here. And it says that they will fall like any one of the princes. Well, what does that mean? Well, they've noticed that throughout the ages, every time they overruled these nations from the spiritual realms, that the physical rulers in the human realm always died. And so, therefore, he says, you're going to die like mere men too, just like they did. So he's pointing up to them that they will experience a physical death. One more thing, it tells us here in verse 8 when this is being projected as happening. Arise, O God, and judge the earth, for it is thou, you, who does possess all the nations. In other words, he died for all people, and now he is coming back to take possession of what he died for. Let's go back and look at somewhere else in Revelation, the last verse of chapter 12 and Revelation 13:1. Now we will get deeper into this in our next video. Let's go ahead and look at those verses for now. And it says, the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went off to make war with the rest of the offspring. Now, woman here, that is an inclusio. So it's tied the entire chapter together. 12 and at the beginning and 12 at the end tells us this is all about the woman. It's all about remnant Israel. And it says something about that. It says, the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went off to make war with who? The rest of her offspring? Yes. Well, who are the offspring? We just can't say that it's Israel specific because it's saying those of Israel who keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus. It is actually showing us who his first target is. Later on, it'll carry over into who the woman's next target is. So the woman here is escaping to the mountains, but in the meantime, any other Jewish believers at that time, and very specifically here, the 144,000 that are alive at the time are going to be the focus of the dragon. You cut off the head, is the goal here, and the body will die. One last verse, it says, he stood on the sands of the seashore. So the dragon now, by standing on the seashore, is actually confirming exactly what Psalm 82 says. And that is that they will die like mere men. In other words, Satan himself will now be active in visible form on earth along with his angels. The seashore represents the cross between the sea. Again, go look at that in Genesis 1, like we talked about it earlier. Go look at it in Isaiah 27:1, where it talks about the Leviathan, and he is now moved out of the realm of the spirit realm into the physical. In our next study, remnant Israel will flee to the mountains of southern Jordan. Called The Flight of the Woman. This is part 3 of our mid-tribulation event study. Understand the dragon is running out of time. His clock is ticking, and he is going to do some drastic things. Again, my name is Vince. Thank you for joining me, and God bless you, and may you enjoy the rest of your week.